So first of all, let me thank all of you for being here, and certainly thank our guests from the Fish and Wildlife Service for taking the time to come by and have a family discussion. Little did I know when I scheduled this, and I turned over the logistics to people smarter than me, that we were going to meet over coffee in a big kitchen. But that's about perfect, isn't it, guys? Isn't that how we generally discuss the issues of the day, is over coffee in a kitchen? I think we should do more of that. Let's put it that way. So today, my intention is to have a discussion. One of the things I learned pretty early on in my service as your member of the People's House was that a lot of people were concerned about wildlife easements, wetland easements. There's a lot of confusion surrounding multiple agencies and multiple divisions within agencies, and the lack of harmony to how certain rules are enforced, how they're drafted, the inconsistencies, things like that. There's been particular interest raised in my shop by people concerned about the growth of the bureaucracy, the growth of an easement, the way the easement was originally entered into, all kinds of questions. And I think what happens is over years and then decades, if we don't reevaluate every now and then what's happening, we kind of lose control of what's happening. When it comes to our private land, that's particularly problematic, isn't it? Yeah, and so I, after hearing enough stories and realizing, by the way, just so you all know, as the only member of a body of 435 representatives from the great state of North Dakota, there are a lot of places that aren't like us, I've noticed. In fact, one of the rich things about being a member of the House of Representatives, knowing that 434 of my colleagues represent someplace other than North Dakota, one of the things I've noticed is that the House of Representatives, aptly named the People's House, is a perfect representation of the diversity of our great country. And so when I talk about wetland issues to the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, Mike Conway from West Texas, he relates very differently to water than we do. They don't have enough of it. We oftentimes have too much of it. And so it's important to reevaluate from time to time. A couple of weeks ago, in preparation for this, and I don't think we'd had the date set yet, or maybe we had just set the date, I did talk to the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, Rob Bishop, who's a very good friend of mine, and we talked about a piece of legislation that's actually coming to the floor next week, and talked about some of the issues you all have shared with me. The lack of good mapping, for example. Don't we all understand that? And we'll see some examples of that. The lack of real detailed legal descriptions, which has become a problem. And noticing that whenever there's confusion, the default doesn't go with the landowner, the default goes to the bureaucracy. And so we talked about that. We talked about NRCS biologists versus Fish and Wildlife Service police officers and how that impacts our relationship. And so we had a good long visit. His name's Greg Sheehan, great guy, a former state guy from Utah that my friend Ryan Zinke appointed as a deputy director. He's acting director currently until more confirmations take place, and your guess is as good as mine. But he's sending a couple of his folks here today. And so Maureen is with us. Welcome from, did you come from Denver? Did you hear? So welcome to the prairies. The mountains are different than the prairies, right? The prairies of North Dakota are different than the prairies of South Dakota. And we know that. Matt knows that. So Matt's here from this district here. And they're here to make some opening comments about the program. And then, by and large, what we're here to do is to hear from you. So we have a few speakers lined up, people who RSVP'd early, organizations that have expressed a particular point of view and frustration. We have a number of legislators. Welcome to all of you. We'll be calling on you one at a time. Some of you may not want to say anything. I talked to Dave Munson earlier, and he said, I'm just here to listen. I said, the best ones are, but no pressure. But we have some conflict with state law, and the director and I talked about that as well. And you ought to know. You know, it's one thing about it is it's sort of fun to be the one guy from North Dakota in this big body, because when you present certain things legislatively, most people don't know what I'm talking about. So sometimes they'll just default because you seem to know. So just last week, and I'd forgotten about this, guys, as we came up here today. Just last week, we were able to get language in an appropriations bill that acknowledges the state law that you guys passed, and that puts report language in there that's in clear conflict with federal law, that encourages the Fish and Wildlife Service to work within the parameters of state law, acknowledging the contentious relationship between landowners and Fish and Wildlife Service. So that passed. And we did something earlier this month, I guess it was last week, we finished it up last week, that we've not done since I've been in Congress, and that is pass all 12 appropriations bills. And while that seems like routine to a North Dakota legislator, it's the first time in 12 years that we've done it in Congress. What's important about that is it's those appropriations bills that allow us to attach things like report language and policy language that becomes part of the appropriation. Sometimes it's the only leverage you have when you're the policy-making branch and you control the purse strings. We hear a lot about that on talk radio and cable TV. And so we were able to get that attached. That's got, while it doesn't have the complete teeth of law, it has clear guidance, and guidance is one of the topics we'll probably talk about today. Because I think there's some guidance that comes out of Fish and Wildlife Service that's not consistent with their own law, much less state law. And this is where discretion becomes part of the picture. So that passed just last week. Now, with all honesty, just because the House did it doesn't mean the Senate will. In fact, most of the time it means they probably won't. They'll try to push a continuing resolution that keeps everything the same. But they're deliberating, as you know, that's what they do. So we sent it over to the House, we did our part. With that, I just, again, welcome to all of you. I'll be facilitating the Q&A and calling on people, and there'll be a time for open mic. But first we want to hear from our agency friends. And Maureen and Matt, I don't know if one of you wants to take the lead on this. Maureen, you take the lead, and welcome to Devil's Lake, welcome to North Dakota, thank you for your service. Let's welcome Maureen too.
Good morning, everyone. I really appreciate being here, and I appreciate the invitation to come out from Denver to listen to your concerns and to try to answer questions and assist Matt in answering questions. Of course, he's our expert on the ground, so you'll probably see me defer to him quite often, particularly if you guys have detailed questions about things. I also want to relay a message from Regional Director Noreen Walsh. She wished she could be here, but she had to be out on another matter, and so she's asked me to come and participate. Again, while I am from Denver, I've only been there a couple of years, but I started my career more years ago than I care to mention. But I started it on the prairies, working with wetlands, easements, and with the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program just over the state line into Minnesota. So it's really great to be back on the prairies, and again, I appreciate the invitation and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything?
I can introduce myself.
Yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Matt Springer. I am the area manager for the Devil's Lake Wetland Management District. We cover 8 counties in the northeastern part of North Dakota. I've been here about 4.5 years. Prior to my position here, I had not worked in North Dakota for the Fish and Wildlife Service, so it was a learning experience for me, being introduced to the Wetland Easement Program and the Easement Program with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I see a lot of familiar faces in here that I've worked with over the last 4.5 years. So I certainly look forward to further hearing your concerns and discussion and dialogue so that I can continue to learn and implement this important program here in North Dakota. So thank you.
Perfect. All right. The first, you guys, I'm going to sit down. You're welcome to. You might want to. What we're going to ask people to do is, as I call on you, is to come up to that microphone right there, and either make your statement, ask your question. These guys will be prepared to try and answer it. If at the end of this there's a legislative needs, we'll talk about that. If it's strictly enforcement, if it's interpretation, all that. We want you to come up to that microphone right there. Also, so that you understand, so you know what these two cameras are about, and I informed the acting director that we would be doing this. We are video recording all of it in as high quality as we're able to make sure that we have a very complete record of what's said here, so that we can, we don't have to guess what somebody said or try to call you back, but we'll have a real good, clear record, which is helpful not only for my personal memory, but as I share information with my colleagues and with others in the bureaucracy, okay? So, let's get started with your concerns, and what we want to do is, as I said, a number of organizations, stakeholder groups are in regular contact with us on this, helped us arrange for this meeting. And we're going to start with Dwight Rangham with the Landowners Association of North Dakota. Dwight, you and I have talked a couple of times, more than a couple of times. You've been to some of my town halls, as have a number of your members. So we want to begin with you, if that's okay, Dwight. Dwight Rangham.
Thank you, Congressman Kramer, for putting me on the spot like that.
You would never do that to me.
Well, thank you very much for being here today and for putting this together, because if there's anything we need in North Dakota, it's better cooperation and understanding between the landowners and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And the Landowners Association of North Dakota, it's been a main issue with them for a long time before I became associated with them, because frankly the landowners feel like they're not being treated fairly. And in North Dakota we pride ourselves in common sense and in following the law and not abusing authority. And so hopefully we can move closer to those things. I myself am not a farmer anymore, and I do not have wetland leases. But the Landowners Association of North Dakota has many members here today who have personal stories that they can relate. So with that, Congressman Kramer, I'd like to just let them speak.
Let me ask this before you sit down, and thank you. Do you have one or two that you'd like to start with?
Yes, Dennis Miller
Okay.
is here, and
I saw Dennis earlier.
he has some things I think prepared. Thank you, and
Thanks, Dwight.
thanks. Dennis.
Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, Representative Kramer and Dwight. I'm a past president of the Landowners Association, and Kevin Reagan is current president now. But anyway, the Landowners Association of North Dakota is dedicated to the preservation of the revenue-generating activities of our farmers and ranchers, along with their most valuable renewable resource, land, to the preservation of our wildlife, environmental, and soil resources through voluntary and compensatory programs to the preservation of property rights. And as I've been involved in the Landowners Association, we just get continual feedback from our members and others about issues they've had dealing with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I sort of smiled when I looked around and I've seen so many landowners here with their easements and these maps that look like circles drawn on a piece of paper, which is what they are, and with no geographical reference to the boundaries of the wetlands. I have a copy of the letter from John Schneider, who was U.S. Attorney at the time, and he was asked what specifically is the result of the USV Johansson case, and Michael Johansson is also here. But anyway, John Schneider's response to that question was that these easements are legal and enforceable, but they must be limited to the acreages in the easement summary. And I have a copy here of the easement summary for Ramsey County. On the whole state, there are 11,500 easement contracts on pre-1976 U.S. Fish and Wildlife easements, and I haven't counted how many are in Ramsey County, but this list was generated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in U.S. v. Johansson to say that we do not, and in their exact words, and I'm not an attorney, so I'm hoping I'm doing this correctly, but their exact testimony in U.S. v. Johansson was that we only control the wetlands. We were given authority to purchase 1,500,000 acres by in a previous agreement, and we only have, at that time, I think it was 732,000 acres. But their testimony was we only control the wetlands, and these are the approximate acreages of wetlands on each contract, cut and dried. So I guess, you know, what I would like to know, being that the U.S. Attorney has interpreted U.S. v. Johansson as saying that the Fish and Wildlife must limit their authority to the acreages in this figure, that means that I can go out and on my particular easement, drain down and de-water everything but 48 acres, and I would be within the in the legal rights of U.S. v. Johansson, what the law of the land is now.
Okay, so I'm not surprised this comes up first. It's a specific question, I think of interpretation, and I think we're all pretty familiar with the situation. Would you prefer to take the first shot at that? Because I think this could help instruct the rest of the discussion.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Well, I'm going to quickly defer to Matt, but the reason being is that, first of all, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't, represent the legal position with regard to that case. But I do understand, what our rights and responsibilities are, and I think you saw Matt and I both nodding a little bit as you were talking. I think you do, in general, have the situation correct, but to get into a really detailed discussion of that, I am going to defer to Matt because he's living and working this every day.
So, Mr. Miller, I agree with almost everything you said. The Johansson case clearly said that we are limited on that easement contract to the summary acreage identified in that report that we sent to Congress as well as the governor. The only thing I would specify in there is it's a cooperative agreement, that we have to work with the landowner and the Fish and Wildlife Service to identify that area that we're going to provide relief within that contract area. So if your easement summary is X acres, and you come into us and say, hey, we need some assistance, we are over acreage, over summary, here's a current map, we'll look at that, review that with you, and work with you to get down to that summary acreage. That my understanding of Johansson is very similar to what you described.
Before, I know I don't want one entity to dominate, but we're on to something I want to dig in just a little bit. For you, Dennis, and others. So what Matt's just described, sounding largely like he agrees, and the opinion of the U.S. Attorney at the time, who represents these guys, not you, is that how you're seeing it enforced? Because if that was the case, I wouldn't see any need for this meeting.
I was in the office 18 months ago, and if my memory serves me correctly, it was in the fall of the year, and I asked, said, I need to know. I need to know where my boundaries are so that I can farm the rest. We've got technology now that we have automatic steer in our tractors, and one dry spring I read 90 pages of a novel while seeding soybeans. And, but in a wet year I can't do that. And it's very inefficient to farm these wetlands, have them flood out, recapture their farming value, go in and maybe get them cropped and have it farmed out. It's greatly inefficient, and we need to have some security. I went in and asked, you know, can I see a map of what the boundaries of my wetlands are, something greater than, you know, this circles drawn on a piece of paper that's got some geographical reference, so that I know that I'm obeying the intent of my easement. The easement that I did not sign and that I have not received any payment for. But anyway, if I can correctly relay, the response I got was, well, this is the fall, it's going to be different by this spring. We don't want to have to do it twice, so we will come out next spring. Well, you know, when the land is ready to farm, I don't want to be in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Office or the IRS office or the FSA office. I want to be in my tractor. And it happened that that spring, which would have been the spring of 16, was very dry, and I thought, well, I don't need, you know, right now I don't need this. And but anyway, I did not get those areas delineated, and they're still not delineated. And so, anyway.
Well done. Was there anything else that you wanted to address before we go on to somebody else? How about, does Kevin Ray, Kevin, do you want to talk on behalf of? He covered, he's good. That's what the chairman now gets to defer to the previous chairman because he got the gap. So you've gotten us started, I think, in a good way here, and I think it illustrates, you know, a problem point. I'm going to call next on Daryl Lease, the president of North Dakota Farm Bureau, to express on behalf of your organization, Daryl, probably a couple of personal things.
Thank you, Congressman Kramer. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Maria, for coming out today. Sometimes you don't know what you're getting into when you come to situations like this, but know that NDFB appreciates the effort to come out and learn, and hopefully that's what happens. You learn the concerns and you take those back to your folks that you answer to and let them know really what is the true concerns out here. And part of NDFB's biggest concern is, you know, we pride ourselves on being the premier private property rights organization. We don't care what your property is, if it's down to just a wristwatch on your wrist or thousands of acres that are very productive in the soils of North Dakota. We protect, and we urge everyone to protect and encourage protection of private property rights in all rulemaking, in all enforcement. And that's the key, is the enforcement side of it. You know, we hear a lot of stories from our members, and you know, Congressman Kramer just alluded to, you know, is that how it's being handled? You know, and we hear quite opposite stories. In fact, quite often opposite stories. We hear of young families that have water approaching their homes and infringing on their homes that they can't manage. That goes beyond those boundaries of the initial wetland. And so that's concerning to the point of, do we truly have an agency representing the United States interest under our constitutional rights, the fact that private property, the ability to protect private property, that there's common sense used, or as I call it, the elusive sense formerly known as common. Because it seems to get away from us nowadays. And when we hear those stories from our membership, we start to ask questions. You know, these young families, many times, most times, have purchased this land that someone else received a payment on. We have very firm policy at NDFB that we are against perpetual easements. Because as Congressman Kramer stated at the beginning, everything should have the ability to be revisited and reevaluated to make sure it's correct for that time in our history going forward. So to restrict these things, we're firmly against that. But the ability is there, so how do we deal with it? How do we manage that? How do we make sure that what was done 50 years ago isn't putting such a restriction on the ability of success of future generations and essentially success of the state of North Dakota? That's what we're looking at. And when we put those restrictions on, when we have enforcement officers, which I have a little bit of a problem calling them enforcement officers because, as you said, Matt, you want to work with the landowner. It's really hard to work with someone when they show up flashing a gun, walking around their house, looking in their windows,
Yes. Yes.
and then saying you want to work with the landowner. Doesn't add up. I'm sorry to say, that is not working with. That is forcing the heavy hand of government. Those things are concerns. Other things that are concerns, and I'm going to ask a couple of questions that I'll let you write down and have some time to think about if you want. One of them won't be hard to answer because most of us know the answer, but I want it on record. Where are the maps pre-1976? We all know the answer to that. It's a concerning answer though, because there's no distinction. And then the next one is, on your current your current proposals, your current acquisitions, what are your wetland criterias to determine boundaries on your current proposals? And the other thing that concerns NDFB members is we see this kind of steadiness and trying to get these easements done until there's a crisis in farm country, and then it's really ramped up by the agency. They want to take advantage, it seems, of tough times, tough pricing, challenging times out on these prairies, and kind of force some hands with a carrot, so to speak, of some money. And then when times get better, you kind of lay back because you're probably not going to be real successful. But the day that that crisis hits, it's almost like there's a memo that goes to the whole agency and the effort is hiked back up again. To me, that's not working with the landowner either. That's almost opportunistic advantage taking of our landowners. And so with those questions, I don't want to monopolize a lot of the time, but I do have our District 5 board director on the state board, Chad Weckerly, who has dealt with several issues dealing with land that has easements on. It might be mitigating, it might be doing a water management project, or it might be just trying to get things determined from not just your agency but NRCS, which is another discussion, but we also know that you guys work in the delineation area of those wetlands also. So with that, Congressman Kramer, if I could defer our technical comments to our resident board director that's the expert on this, Chad Weckerly.
That'd be fine, Chad.
I'm Chad Weckerly. I farm with my father and my grandfather 85 miles southwest of Devil's Lake here, a little town called Hertzfield. And wetland, we're the heart of the prairie pothole region, right? We're that heart of that duck flyway and goose migratory pattern. We understand that because we get numerous folks from North Carolina or South Carolina or Georgia or whatever knocking on doors looking for land rights, right? And so with that, we know that we have a great resource in the area. We also know that we have some very sensitive cropland, and that it has to be managed properly. So we've definitely in our farm been trying to implement water management practices that we have to have this maintenance on our property, to keep the value, to increase our crop yields and so on. And so with that, when we started looking at what we could do with tile and how that could be implemented, we started a conversation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife as well as NRCS. And what I've presented to you is a wetland easement on one of those very properties here. And, you know, it's $400 for 40 acres of wetland back then. And this easement costs me far more than that every year, and what I'm penalized because this easement's on here. This particular easement, as you can see on the second page of your document, Wallace Radke thought he was above things, that he drained land and then sold off easements. And so there are a couple of wetlands on these easements that were drawn out. And that you can see on the dotted line there on the second page. Now, on the third page is the easement summary, which says that you've got 40 acres on this particular property. Okay? Trouble is that when you look at page 4 in your document, this is what I got from your agency back in 2013. The large wetland to the bottom, at the very bottom left corner of section of my parcel here, is a 12-acre wetland. The large one in the middle of the field on the right-hand side is a 32-acre wetland. You got your 40 acres. And you see all the other circles on this property? You see the one that was drawn out back in '65 when this easement was signed? Do you think there were wetlands uphill from that wetland back in '65? If Wallace Radke put the drain in and drew out that one, do you think that there were more uphill that he forgot about? So I'm told by your office back in 2013 that I cannot put water management practices in place anywhere on this parcel. That nowhere on this property can I put tile. The next page that I have here is an NRCS wetland determination. And we know that their determinations are in very different criteria than what your determinations are. They're looking for hydric soils, wetland vegetation, and that it ponds water for long greater than 10 days during the growing season. Where's your criteria? Because they have already allocated more wetland acres than what your easement summary covers. They have set setback distances for me. And so I have a very heavy clay soil in the acreage that I farm. So typically a setback distance with NRCS is going to be around 125 feet. And yet when I come to your office, it's going to be all of 400 feet, and the only time it's less is when the watershed break, and the water literally falls the other way, right? It's 200 feet if 200 feet's the top of the hill. Now, I think it took me 3 hours of conversation with people from your office here till I finally figured out where the difference was. You guys are all using the Van Schiffgard model for tile setbacks, am I correct?
Yes, you are.
But you're using that model so very differently that it changes everything. You know, I can find some compromise with NRCS, and it's not one that I'm happy with either, okay? But maybe it's one that's a little more palatable, that at least allows me to get something done. And when I come to your office, all walls are up. So, again, I come back to this very direct question. You've got, it's an old easement, okay? A lot of these easements are 50 years and longer, okay? Which tells me that you own the oldest water, okay? And to say the oldest water means you own the deepest water, the deepest of the basins. And my feeling is every time I have a conversation with your offices, instead of you admitting that you own the bottom 8 feet, you want the top 2 feet because it covers the most area. And it changes every year. And that's not what you purchased in 1965 on this easement at all. I'm a little passionate about this because I'm very passionate about what I do. I work day in and day out as a farmer and also as an agronomist with Hefty Seed Company. And that end, I've gotten a lot of training on soils in our area. And I've got a great deal of understanding about what creates yield in my field, what I need to do to create the right habitat. And I want what you want. We should want the same thing. We're concerned about value and function of our property. And not just because I need to grow higher yields to be successful in my industry, but because when I add value and function back to my ag real estate, it also benefits the wetland habitat around. And we have a great problem in North Dakota and our heavy clays. Any year we're getting more than 16 inches of rainfall, right? When we get a buildup of sodium around these, we've got ways to manage that now. But yet, I keep hearing an argument, well, yeah, you got that sodium and it's going to leach out through that drain tile, and I'm going to put all these salts in these sloughs. Yet, I keep taking water quality tests out of my tile line, and I'm having a hard time finding where there's a big problem with the sodium and it actually comes out. And it's such a minimal amount that has to, and now I can produce crops again. I mean, so one of the things on these maps that you've seen on that wetland determination map from the NRCS is that great big section through the middle of the field that's all white. Okay? You page on just past that, and you'll find my yield map from a soybean harvest. It's clearly not wetland area. Obviously, it was drawn out of the easement and it was drained, but it produces nothing unless I can do something about it. And that's something I can do about it is at my fingertips. I own the tile plow. I can have this put in a day's time. I could spread some gypsum on this property that I could get out at Stanton, which would add a lot of calcium to that soil salinity. We could start bringing crop life back to this piece. In 5 years' time, we could be looking at some very good yields out of the heart of that field. So it's practical that in 10 to 15% of my farm, these wetland acres are keeping me from getting any production. Now, to the easement summary question, I have another point to make on that. So I brought this map and I use this easement, okay, because it's very straightforward. Most of my easement summaries are not straightforward because the easement summary back then is not all owned by the same land ownership today. And so a lot of these have multiple tracks included here. But if I can't get you to delineate one field down, how am I going to get you to sit there where it's a 1,500 acre easement and it has numerous tracks that are owned by 2 or 3 different landowners? How are we going to figure that out? Because I don't know a way to really figure that out without me going and hiring Houston Engineering and coming at you with an attorney, because that's how that's gone. I know there's a lot of speakers here, Congressman. I could go on.
I suspect you could, but thank you, Chad, for what you've done and for presenting what I suspect a lot of other speakers are going to present, similar situations. I do have a question, though, that Daryl brought up that I think would be worthy maybe of a response. And at least let me tell you this. I spoke about this issue, Daryl, of sort of the police state of affairs, the enforcement, the heavy-handed enforcement, because I hear it from a lot of people. And I brought it up with the acting director, and he was a little surprised, actually, about it. And he's a state guy, he's a state guy that's now working in the federal government. Trying to realize and understand that you are, in fact, dealing with peace officers that are deputized, that do have enforcement authorities. Well, unlike the NRCS where you're dealing with a biologist, so it's a little easier to have that kitchen table relationship with a biologist than it is with an enforcement officer. That's probably more of a resource issue than anything else. But, and I also spoke to the regional director about this quite emphatically, and just said there's got to be a difference between being a game warden on a refuge and being a counselor to a farmer. There just has to be. And if you have to train them to do 2 jobs rather than just be the one, you've got to figure this out. It's not a trifling matter. And so I'm hoping that's going to start being dealt with. I understand that, again, we're asking people to do multiple jobs and they might be trained for one. But whether it's a training issue or whether it's a resource issue, we need to know about it. So again, anybody can reinforce that, I'm happy to hear all about it, but we're also trying to address it. Chad, very well done. I'm going to call next. Just in case you don't know, I have a list of people that I'm going to call on in order here so that you're ready. And the next 3 are Dan Watson with grain growers, then Ryan Peterson with the soybean growers, and then Terry Borsted with the North Dakota Farmers Union. Okay, and then we're going to go on to some legislators. Okay? So first, Dan. I saw Dan, so I know you're there, unless he chickened out. You know, he is very shy. And so, otherwise known as Mr. Clean. Here's
Well, thank you, Congressman, and never, ever give a recovering politician a microphone. I'm just going to say.
too late.
Actually, our past president, Brad Dickinson, is going to give the statement on behalf of the North Dakota Grain Growers Association. So Brad is a farmer from the Portland, North Dakota area, and is, in our view, one of the experts in water management in the state of North Dakota.
He is in mine as well. I've noticed he's got a little experience. So Brad, thank you. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Congressman. Brad Dickinson, like Dan said, past president of North Dakota Grain Growers, so I'm on my sunset tour here, so I guess it's...
That'll teach you not to show up at the meeting.
There you go, there you go. You know, when it comes to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, my issue basically started with the NRCS. But back in 2010, when I met with Chief White out in D.C., and actually in 2010 I was Chief White not only came to the farm once, but twice that year. The biggest concern I had dealing back with NRCS, and it's the same thing I hear with that U.S. Fish and Wildlife is having, is that all of a sudden when it became an enforcement agency, the education got dropped. And I think that's what U.S. Fish and Wildlife is butting up against right now, is that we're more heavy on the enforcement and we're forgetting about the education part. If I look over on this side of the room, I can say that, you know, most of these guys are so far removed from driver's ed training, right? But if I look over here, I see some young people and they got driver's ed training still back in the back of their mind. How would you like to take driver's ed training from a patrolman with his cap on sitting in the car? How could you handle that car? How could you retain any information? If you have that type of, you know, stigma, like we talk about, you know, the carrying the hardware, you know, and walking up to the door and, you know, using the police officer mentality, you don't get any education done. And I think that's where U.S. Fish and Wildlife is struggling with a lot of, you know, issues, is because there's not a lot of education. The other thing, personally, on our end of the thing, these long 50-year easements and things like that are a lack of communication. But if you don't have that respect, you're not going to be able to communicate. We took over some land about 3 years ago, did some water management on it, very lightly or whatever, and all of a sudden we found out there was a, you know, wildlife easement on it. So that was my son's first engagement with the, you know, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Now, the landlord is in the home. She has a tough time with her memory right now. I assume her and her husband signed the easement and there's some documentation at the courthouse. But as a new tenant, we didn't even go to the, you know, extent of finding that. And her kids didn't even know about it because the parents had signed it up years ago. So there's a void there that needs to, when you get these long-term easements that have to be educated. Now, I don't know how that happens. I don't have the answer to the mechanics. I'm just saying that is also a problem, and that also puts people in a very, you know, uncomfortable situation. But get back to education. I know we have to have the enforcement. I know it didn't work real well in North Dakota, but the wetland team determination on the NRCS was a brainchild of Chief White, and I probably planted that seed. You know, of course, we ended up with a backlog. Congressman Kramer, I'll give that NRCS plug right now, but you know, we need to get that our determinations prior to 1996 need to become certified on the NRCS issue, and that would take that backlog out. So with that, any questions?
I would just add, Representative Peterson and I do have, and Representative Noem have legislation that would deem pre-1996 delineated if they don't get their act together like in a short time. In fact, a lot of the things I learned about regulating, and this came up a lot yesterday, I was with 3 former governors and a couple of senators at a pipeline siting, and one of the things that warmed my heart was the members of the Public Service Commission were there, and the commission I used to sit on. And much of what we did here, what they continue to do here in terms of shot clocks, defaulting, not to the government, but defaulting to the landowner or to the private citizen or to the investor, we're trying to incorporate more on the federal side so that the bureaucracy can't, either on purpose or by nature, just creep by stalling. So great points. So thanks for that, Brandon. Thank you. I'm jotting down just a few highlights. So if people want to address them, I want enforcement discretion. That's one thing I want to get to, because I'm not sure if some of the things you're raising are legislative, if they're code issues, if they're enforcement issues, if they're rules and regulation issues as opposed to legislative issues, if it's just tradition that's gotten out of control. So anybody that can help clarify that for me, and I know we do have some attorneys in the room, even though none of us were blessed with that. Appeals process, we haven't heard a lot about that yet, so if somebody wants to address that as well. I think one of the things, we complain a lot about the ability to appeal, like at NRCS, for example, Brad, somewhere outside of the NRCS itself, but at least there's an administrative process for doing that, which there doesn't seem to be here. That's another issue that I think, if anybody wants to address, I'd love to. And then this whole mapping lack of legal description things are pretty obvious problem. So with that, next I have on my list, Ryan Peterson from Northwest Soybean Growers. I think Ryan has some illustrations on your on PowerPoint, huh?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Chad, for pretty much doing my presentation already. But
yeah, you brought slides.
So my PowerPoint will be so everyone in the audience can see the maps Chad gave out. But first, Congressman Kramer, thank you for putting this together, Marine map for being here. I think Brad brought up a very good point, is grower organizations, we have developed really good relationships with NRCS, USDA. That's what we are, we're farm groups. We work with USDA. We have not developed that relationship with the Department of Interior because, as the Congressman said, this is a small issue when you look at nationwide. So a lot of the nationwide organizations aren't that interested in it. So we need to start this relationship that has moved forward with NRCS. So I'm glad we're here. So what I did was put together the same map. Of course, I can't lay it nice because I've been told we are not allowed to have shape files. We're not allowed to have digital copies of the map. So you get some crude farmer trying to put together a PowerPoint. The dotted lines are the wetlands that my grandpa withheld from the easement. Now, the easement document I have has no acreage summary. It says he sold the wetlands. No acreage, he sold the wetlands. So to Chad's point, the two big ones, they're wet. I mean, they are permanent water, you're not gonna drain. The dotted ones are drainable wetlands. The little tiny ones are not. You need to put in some reason, some thinking. So if a farmer was going to go through the work of excluding wetlands from the easement, is it not reasonable? Darrell talked about common sense. Can we not have some common sense that those small little easements on the right, or small little wetlands, or what have been labeled as wetlands on the right-hand side, would have been excluded if Grandpa had any sense that they would be called a wetland. So are they called a wetland? Well, so then I went, again, I'm a farmer, I'm trying to put together some crude maps, I apologize, but said, I'm going to take the same land, I'm going to take the NRCS determination, the NRCS setbacks. So I want to do some tiling. The green areas, I can't tile according to NRCS unless I do some mitigation. Mitigation the NRCS allows, U.S. Fish and Wildlife does not allow. So like, all right, I'm a nerd. My wife did warn me, Ryan, don't nerd it up too much today. But
Is she telling you to play the crude farmer role? Because I'm not buying that either.
So I said, what if I take U.S. Fish and Wildlife, what they labeled as wetlands? Don't agree with it, and I think we've seen common sense is they probably shouldn't have been labeled as wetlands, and I used NRCS setbacks. The green area is what I cannot tile. I think we all know where we're going with this. Here we go. U.S. Fish and Wildlife wetlands, U.S. Fish and Wildlife setbacks. The green area is where, come on, I cannot tile. So here is the map. The solid lines are what was purchased. Is some contention about the small areas on the right, if they should even be included or not. The green is what is controlled. So when we look at acreage summary, when we look at state law, the acres U.S. Fish and Wildlife can hold, they are controlling the green area. They're not controlling the area within the lines, they're controlling the green area. So do we need to remap all of the acres, add all of the green areas, and see if they're still within state law for total acreage? That's a question for the speakers later today. Chad talked about, and here's where we nerded up a little, how are they determining the setbacks? They're using the Van Schilfgaard equation. And if you ask them, they're doing it the same as NRCS, they're just changing one variable, the drawdown. NRCS allows a drawdown of 1 foot. Now ultimately, U.S. Fish and Wildlife says there should be no effect to the wetland, which means the drawdown should be 0. If you put 0 into the Van Schilfgaard equation for a drawdown, the tile setback is infinity. You cannot tile anywhere in the world. That's the way the model works. So what do? They put .1. So you need some number. They put .1. I did 3 different things. NRCS minimum, and if the numbers aren't exactly right, I apologize, 64 feet. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, 390. Now Chad said he has worked with them, that has been narrowed some. But this is, when I made that first call, I was told 600 feet. But like my wife says, your 3-year-old keeps asking why. He gets it from me. After an hour on the phone of asking why, we got to narrow down a little. Maximum setback, 5,692 feet. So when we leave, if you live west of here, when you get in between Joe's Sport Shack and the Summers, that is where you could put tile if you wanted to tile this room on a certain soil type. So is that right? So I started looking at why are they coming with this, and they have the Prairie Pothole Regional Easement Manual. And it talks about using the Van Schilfgaard, and also talks about a Sands and Carlson study that addresses runoff, because ultimately these wetlands are typically filled with spring runoff. And in that study they said 18 to 60% of spring runoff may be reduced because of tile drainage. The interesting thing is the first line of that study, the authors state, artificial subsurface drainage has produced some of the most productive soils in the world. So because of these setbacks, we are not allowed to produce some of the most productive soils in the world. If you're going to use their work later in the document, you got to look at the front cover too. The other thing in that study that is cited in this manual is yields from subsurface drainage. They did 100% being total. Undrained yields average 53 to 59%. Tile drain, 100%. So that is the yields, that is the financial implication that these easements are costing us. But I don't think it's fair of us to come and only complain. I think we need to give some some ideas of solutions. The soybean growers has come up with 3, and I'm sure there's more. Number 1, if it's good enough for NRCS, it is good enough for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I talked to a couple of the drain tile people at NDSU, and we talked about point 1 in the Van Schilfgaard equation. And I don't want to put words in their mouths, but ridiculous may have come out. So, number 2, mitigation. We recognize, I think we all recognize in here, an easement document was signed. Money transferred, so there is some ownership of wetlands. NRCS will allow us to move wetlands. If we have 1 dot in there that's creating the 600-foot radius that's rooting an entire tile project, it's not cheap, but we can do it. I think Brad's done it, I've done some. It is an option, NRCS allows, U.S. Fish and Wildlife does not. Number 3 gets bigger picture, and it's to Congressman Kramer. These easements are legal documents. I'm not a lawyer, I watched a lot of night court growing up, so I have some understanding. But if both parties to a legal document, a contract, want out, there should be a mechanism to get out. Now we also have to be cognitive of conservation. We have to work with the conservation groups. So we have to think, how can we structure this? So an idea we've had is, it is our understanding that there is a backlog of people wanting to sell easements to the Fish and Wildlife.
It's right here.
There is people in this room that would likely try to buy out. Now, it's not reasonable to give Chad $400, or let Chad give $400 to get out of his easements. You know, we have to address that. But what if we put together a program where every year X amount of dollars have to be sold back? And then we have a panel that says, okay, you put in your bids, so for this thing, I may pay $10,000 to get out of that easement. Another tract of land, I may only pay $2,000. So then you can decide which ones do we sell back, take that money, reinvest it to the people who want to be under these easements. That just move the assets around. And when we come up with manuals, this manual stated who they worked with. It never stated that the landowner had any input in this manual. It never came up for a public hearing. And I believe the landowner, on behalf of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is paying the property taxes on those wetlands. So Congressman Kramer, Maureen and Matt, thank you for your time.
Thank you, very well done. And a couple of things before we go to Terry from Farmers Union. The harmonized issue, I think, is really important because NRCS, you know, NRCS was my mission my last term in Congress. And as Brad knows and several of you know, we were able to remove some of the potential conflict of interest within the offices so that the advisors, counselors were more in sync with the landowner and not with a potential conflict. I think that's been helpful. I hope it has. I was also able to get in my first term the Kramer Amendment in the Farm Bill, which I think NRCS is honoring pretty well from what I hear, and that is to incent the landowners to deal with the nuisance wetlands in a way that actually incents them to mitigate acre for acre, because we require acre for acre as opposed to the discretion of a biologist to make acre for acre 5 acres per acre. And that literally has incented some appropriate drainage as well as some creation of wetlands. So NRCS was my first mission. This Congress, clearly it's, we're moving along, but I love the talk of harmony. I think it's really, really important. Mechanism to get out of the contract, that'll be for later in the program. Okay, so Terry, if we could hear from you and North Dakota Farmers Union, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Congressman Kramer, and thank you, Representative from the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm Terry Borstad. I'm elected by our voting members for 40,000 members that we have in the organization in North Dakota. I represent the northeastern part of the state. I also serve as the state treasurer. Last week, I spent 5 days in Washington, D.C. And thank you, Congressman Kramer. I know other times we've met with you. Then this time you had a conflict and you sent a couple of your staff people over. They did a good job.
Thank you. They're here, so you said it in front of them.
Thank you.
Now that's going to be a problem for me, but don't let that bother you.
Thank you. Part of the time we spent in D.C., with half a day, we met with the Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, and I had an opportunity to visit with about 1 minute with him. And he really seemed concerned about North Dakota. He asked about the crops here, he asked about the drought. Other times we've been to Washington, D.C., we've had the opportunity one time to meet with the head of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And there, he said his goal anyway was to become more farmer friendly. And I sure hope the organization has become more farmer friendly. I farm both in Ramsey County and in Benson County. My Benson County farm is doing real good with water. It's part of that farm is under 20 feet of water. It has a wildlife easement on it, so you're doing a real good job. The other land that I farm is about 20 some miles north of here by the town of Starkweather. I've had personal experiences with the Fish and Wildlife Service. One of the experiences a few years back, I worked with a landlord to clean out a natural drain, a drain that's been there, it's natural, no artificial. It starts up in Cavalier County, it ends up in Devil's Lake, the water retention. When we we initially met with the water board, Ramsey County Water Board, and from that, then we started meeting with representatives from the Fish and Wildlife Service. This whole thing took 2 years. If we weren't persistent, we got the impression you leave us alone. That's the impression we got. When I go out here to the FSA office or the NRCS, those employees, they act like they really want to help us. I'm sorry, but the people in your office acted like, go away. I hope you get that message. We worked 2 years. All we wanted to do was go in there and clean out the cattails. There was cattails that had built up there, so it couldn't, it backed up water on the land that we farmed. We were persistent. We'd go in there and they said, well, we don't have the authority here. We have to go to Denver. And then Denver gets back to us. But eventually we got the job done. And we paid for it. It was no cost to the government. We paid for the cleaning. But why should it take 2 years to get something like that done? I farm land that has fish and wildlife easements on it. One is a section of land directly north of the town of Starkweather. Back in the 50s, that was put into a wildlife easement. On that section of land, the landowner got $1,800. This year, in past years, being so wet, I'm farming about 400 acres out of that 600. Part of that section, and you probably know where it's at, is right along Highway 20. There's about a 20-acre section there that's sold to the Fish and Wildlife Service years ago. Currently, the city of Devil's Lake has a water project going on supplying water to the towns of Langdon and Candu. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Absolutely.
My question is, last week, this week now, they put down the pipe. It goes through our land. When it gets up to that little bit of fish and wildlife land, they take a jog and go completely on our land. If your organization, I realize that you enforce the law, you don't make the law. But why, if you want to be farmer friendly, those of us farmers, we're more or less donating our land to help out the cities of Langdon and Canada. They pay us crop damage. But why does it have to take a jog around fish and wildlife land when they have a project for that? If you're farmer friendly, why do you do that? Why can't it go on fish and wildlife land? They put the pipe, they're telling me 6.5 feet under the ground. They reseed it to grass. But the rest of us, we're more or less donating our land for the city of Devils Lake. Is that policy?
Let's ask, and let's see if we can answer that question since you have a specific question. Is that policy? Is that CYA? Why do you just not have that discretion to answer his question? You know.
Well, I don't want to keep deferring to Matt, but I have to because this is a specific instance, and typically when these things happen, we have various vehicles, such as special use permits, etc. So it really depends on how it was managed.
Yeah, so when a project crosses land that is owned by the U.S. government, a right-of-way is needed for such a project. And part of the right-of-way process is going through the National Environmental Policy Act. It's not something we made up in the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's a law that we have to follow. Typically, that process, going through a National Environmental Policy Act process, issuing a right-of-way, is anywhere from 6 months to a year. And so the project proponent on this, and I worked specifically with this project, they chose to cross the road there and keep it rolling on private land rather than go through the process that's necessary to get a right-of-way across to federal land.
So, in other words, your worst neighbor is the federal government.
Right.
And because on these areas, and you guys, this is at the heart of so much of what I deal with every single day, and why turning it back is so difficult. Remember, those other 434 colleagues of mine aren't as reasonable as you all. And so, when it comes to things like NEPA and federal land or even any federal nexus, the path of least resistance, tragically, is the private landowner, as opposed to the publicly owned land. Because I flippantly referred to CYA, but that's really a large part of it. Whether it's NEPA or an EIS or EA, whatever it might be, I'm telling you that the agencies are well trained and well versed in make it as difficult as possible so that we don't get sued by our friends generally, and then end up, paying everybody's legal fees. Let's see if we can't go through a reasonable guy's land who's a better citizen than the government. And that's a terrible tragedy in our system.
I was told that there was, they had to obtain 320 easements for that whole project.
Yeah. And that was easier than getting one from the federal government.
Going back years and years, I started farming in the Starkweather area in 1975. And when I first started farming up there, I had an issue with the city of Starkweather dumping their lagoon into our land and going down the coulee. So I thought, well, I contacted the Fish and Wildlife Service to see if there was something they could do. And that was my first introduction to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I set up a meeting to meet out just outside of Starkweather, just off the highway, because I thought it was better to show them where the water went than to try to meet in the office. My introduction to the Fish and Wildlife Service was one person who was with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the other guy was with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and he had a gun in his side. Now, I was a very young farmer at the time, and that's intimidating. I sure hope the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't have a practice of doing that anymore. If somebody first initially visits with the Fish and Wildlife Service, do you have that practice anymore?
So can I ask a question of all of you? Is that what you are experiencing now when you have an initial contact with Fish and Wildlife Service? You're typically visited by one of our law enforcement officers?
Yes.
Raise your hand.
Raise your
That's
hand,
the case.
please. I just want, we're being videotaped, so it helps me to see the numbers and count through.
How about, do they ever wear their vests?
Yes.
Raise your hands if they wear their bulletproof vests. Other hardware dangling from the belt.
Armament, yes.
Armament, okay.
So the one thing that I will say is, with respect to our law enforcement officers, is that when when they're working, and quite frankly, even when they're off duty, a law enforcement officer is a law enforcement officer all of the time. They wear their gear, even when they're sitting in the office, they're wearing their gear. And this is something that we've spent a lot of time talking about, you know, that how do you balance between safety and, you know, for lack of a better phrase, freaking out the public, you know, because you look pretty rough and tough and intimidating. I've actually spent a lot of time talking about this and what is it that we should have on a duty belt, that's what we call it, and should they be wearing their Kevlar vest on the outside or on the inside, and what should it look like? And so I think we are making steps to make our law enforcement officers look a little softer. Now that's a different issue that we're dealing with, as opposed to should a law enforcement officer even be going out and making the contacts, or as I'm hearing from all of you is should it be a biologist or a manager like Matt that doesn't carry a badge and doesn't need to wear the protective gear? And so I just want to say that I'm hearing a couple of different things, but the most important is should it even be an officer to begin with?
I can understand if they've been threatened or at risk. I can understand that. But if you make an initial request to talk to Fish and Wildlife personnel to come out here, I can't see why. To me, it's a waste of money, waste of time.
Well, as I said, I did visit with Dr. Shannon specifically about that. He was frankly surprised by some of what I shared with him, and now you've demonstrated evidence. The second thing, I visited with Secretary Zinke about it, and he's a Navy SEAL. You talk about rough and tough guys, but he's intimidating without anything because he's a big guy. But Ryan, too, expressed concern about it.
But, in conclusion, could I just ask that when farmers come to your office, train your personnel to be act like you're really there to help them, rather than ask you to go away. I've been to your office, and they say, well, so-and-so isn't here that deals with that. Couldn't they at least take your name and number and get back to you? Could you do that, please? Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. And Bread Farmers Union's position on with everybody's on these are the issues, so thank you for that. Okay, we're going to try to clip along here so we don't run out of time, but we've got a number of legislators who have very personal interests as well as legislative interests, and as I said, we've been able to get some language in to try and harmonize federal law with state law, so thanks for your leadership on that. Let's start with Representative Dennis Johnson from right here.
Thank you, Congressman Kramer and Matt and Maureen. And first, I'd like to acknowledge the students from Devil's Lake here. What a great opportunity to have a civic lesson right here in our hometown today. But I chair the House Ag Committee. There's a lot of familiar faces behind me when we had this hearing in 2013 dealing with the length of the easements, 50 years, 30 years. Representative Edlund was prime sponsor on that, so he's going to talk about the bill a little bit. But we had standing room only, and everybody there has a story. And I heard Chad's story. I look around the room and I know what the stories are by the people I see here, and very good stories. I almost hesitate to tell my story because there's some really good stories out there. But just quickly, I'll tell you my experience of coming home from Vietnam in February. I come home and my dad being the old 40-year-old farmer, and I was a young kid ready to really get with it. I rented a scraper that fall and wanted to go out and clean up some of these nuisance spots. I thought this would be a good idea so we could go back and forth instead of around sloughs. And so nothing really got that serious, but we did our job. And along about January, we're all feeding cows, and here this pickup comes in the yard with the emblems on the door. And who the heck's that? And they get off, they have their uniforms on and side irons and come walking down to the cows and what the hell is going on here? And Fish and Wildlife and introduced themselves and want to know my dad was Mr. Johnson, and he was, and he come over and laid their maps on the hood, and by God, they had every spot. They knew exactly where I did with that scraper. we had till the 1st of April to get them filled in, or they see us important part of it. Well, he says, ground's pretty hard then, well, they'd give us a 30-day extension to get them filled in. And that's, well, why do I have to fill them in? He says, we've got an easement on your ground. And he says, wait a minute. He says, it was about a year and a half ago, the guy come about supper time, drank a lot of coffee and wanted to buy the stool up in the pasture. And he says, well, there's no reason really to sell it. And he says, well, he says, we'd just like to protect it, to keep it for the waterfall and stuff. And you can start looking at numbers and pay the taxes that year. So Dad's, yeah, I'll sell you his easement on the stool. And so, showing that we couldn't be messing around with wetlands in the field, that's why he says, wait a minute, he says, I'm going to Devil's Lake tomorrow, and he says, I'm going to find this guy that got the easements, and he'll explain to you how it was stood in the pasture. We never even talked. You only know you even got this other farm on here. We never even talked about that farm. And he says, no, he says, I'm about 4th page in, small print, all wetlands on your farm are eased. So we rented a scraper to fill them all in, and my dad went to his grave just upset that he was hoodwinked on that deal. And so I got a couple other farms that rent. That generation, about the same age, had the same story. The guy showed up about sometime, he got transferred out about a year later. And the one other story that just really gets me is I bought a farm from a neighbor lady a couple miles down the road. And she had about a 30-acre pasture, and they had got waterfowl production area on the slough. Always had livestock and pasture. And so I was custom harvesting. I went south that spring. And the same guy always rented pasture, had his horses in there again. And my wife called me and said, Fish and Wildlife is out there. You gotta get those horses out of that pasture. And what for? They can't be drinking the water. I said, all this time. I called the landlady up almost yesterday. She's 80-some years old. She got so excited, she says, I had sat at the table and said there's never going to be a problem with livestock in that pasture drinking out of the water. So I got home up this way about 3 weeks later. First place I went, just burning under my saddle for 3 weeks thinking about this. I went over there. Meantime, the guy had his horse there. He's got his horses out there. He's all excited. He didn't want to get in trouble. And I went over there, and yeah, you can't have livestock in that pasture. And it was back and forth on that, and I finally said, fine. I know where the signs are, I'm going to go home and get the wishing disc, and we're breaking her up to the signs. We'll break that pasture up. Well, wait a minute, maybe we can work something out. If you mow the road and don't break the pasture up, you can have cattle in there. And I said, you know what? I have to mow the road every summer the way it is. That's the road is always mowed when you come. Because I like to keep all my roads mowed. And so they come in the fall, they'll pick up the trailer and go by, they never mow the road because I mow it. But that's the kind of farmer-friendly people we are working with. I had a constituent call me one day, he's all excited. He had a half section he's renting, and they had a big rock by the edge of the stool, and they finally got dug out, and they rolled it over onto the grass. Not only he got a letter from Fish and Wildlife, but his landlord out of the area got a letter. I had to get out of there because it was in the way of the flyway, I guess. But he almost lost that land because of that damn rock that got rolled over on the side. And so, it's just anecdotal stories, and there's a lot more stories and better ones behind me. I've heard them. But this is the farmer-friendly people we're working with. The side irons, yeah, I hadn't been home from the service that long. I'd be having nervous to see somebody else that got an idea. That shouldn't probably have been said, but that's the feeling that you get right away, what's going on here. So, thanks for being here. Thanks for bringing this to Devil's Lake, North Dakota, because there is a story here.
There is. Thank you, Dan, for that. Thanks for your service. I'm going to switch over to the Senate side, have Senator Wanzik come up, and then Craig, I'll have you next. Is that okay? Terry, you go ahead, and then I'll have Craig Edlin and Mike, okay?
Yes, thank you, Congressman Kramer and Matt and Maureen. I really appreciate that you've taken this time to hear our concerns. I'd like to always be sure and let people know yes, I am a state legislator, state senator, but I'm a farmer first, 4th generation. The 5th generation is at home combining pinto beans, which is what I would be doing if it wasn't here, but they recognize the importance and seriousness of this situation. I I guess my ask or my issue would be, you know, and I think you already heard it, can there be a more reasonable approach to dealing with this? I do get it, I do understand the legalities of the easement, I do question the overreach, you know, whether they're legally authorized to go beyond what I believe the easement is covering. A couple examples that I would provide, and not only have I, the situation I'll provide with you, not only goes beyond the wetland easement, in my opinion, it goes even beyond wetlands. And the situation that I'm going to share with you is south of Cleveland in Stutsman County, when that road has had to be built up about 3 times in the last 15 years because of the rising water level. Excuse me. And anyway, we had a neighbor next to us that the contractor solicited to get clay out of the hill to build up the grade through the wetland area where the road was being, you know, was vulnerable to damage to the grade. And it was all set up, the contractor was ready to go, and here came the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, put a stop to it. And I guess my question is, what does the clay on the top of the hill have to do with the wetland that they have an easement in? They're going even beyond, you know, the authority of taking care of their easement property, in my opinion. And it just doesn't make sense to me. And I know this is not in line with the easement issue, but another thing that really kind of irks me, and we as county taxpayers had to pay for, is every time we raised our road, and why is the road being threatened is because the wetland is growing, the water levels are coming up higher, you know, potentially damage the road, causing safety issues. But every time we raised that road, we as county taxpayers had to go out and buy land and mitigate that. Why do we have to mitigate a wetland that is growing in size, and we're simply trying to provide safety for the public good in caring for that road? I know that's not, you know, in line with the easement issue, but it really makes me scratch my head. But anyway, I think you're going to hear that more often tonight. I think we're reasonable people. You know, I'm an avid sportsman. It's been a tradition in our family forever. On opening day of duck season, uncles, grandparents, we all go out and hunt. And you know, deer hunting, fishing, that's all part of our life, and we take that seriously. And I do believe that if we approach this in a reasonable way and with common sense, there are win-win situations out there. You know, I think that myself and everyone else here that is a private landowner has a right to their property to improve it and make it more productive. And we are doing some tiling now. We have done a few mitigation projects with the NRCS on land that doesn't have an easement in it, but we do have land that has an easement. We actually bought, we have never signed an easement myself. I recall my grandfather, who would be roughly 124 years old today if he was here, but I recall him sharing with us that he was subsidized or paid to drain that swamp-infested area to make it more productive. You know, we maybe went too far back then. Now I'm wondering if we're not going too far the other way in trying to protect those wetlands. Anyway, and if I can ever help in any way, obviously, as a state legislator, we will. And we did sponsor a bill a couple sessions ago, and as you're well aware of, to try and address this issue.
Thank you, Senator Craig, and I'll have you come next, and you'll be able to describe the bill. I would say you sparked one thing for me, Terry, and you think reasonable people can solve this. One of the issues that I've noticed when I talk to my colleagues, especially my colleagues that represent areas like ours up and down the flyway, part of what we as North Dakotans are suffering from, and part of why we're unique, is because of this stewardship that comes naturally to all of you. We did not drain everything when everyone else was draining everything. We are sort of the last great place on earth, at least in the United States, that has managed our wetlands and our prairies in a reasonable manner. to the benefit of everybody. And now what we have, as I see it, is a hyper overprotection of what was natural to us. And that protection is coming at us, being imposed on us in a very unnatural way. And so, thanks for the history lesson, because I think really it is our stewardship in many respects that's being punished today. With that, Representative Hevlin, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Congressman Kramer and Matt and Maureen for being here. I'd like to make a comment before I get into the legislation that we have put forward. And that is, when we're discussing coming, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife employee coming to a farmer's yard, packing his weapon, I think most people believe, and I believe it myself, it's not any oversight of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. It's done for a purpose, and that is to intimidate. To the legislation. The first piece of legislation I offered in 2011 was a resolution. A simple resolution asking Congress to renegotiate or to pass a law to have U.S. Fish and Wildlife renegotiate, because farmers were having trouble with getting anywhere in discussions and in trying to manage water on their property. That passed overwhelmingly, fairly easy. It was sent to the congressional delegation as well as to the Secretary of Interior and to U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Never heard anything.
I wasn't in Congress yet.
So with that being said, the next session was upon us, and I had personal experience with U.S. Fish and Wildlife over some burning of some cattails that they deemed were part of their easement. And it frustrated me because, it's land I'd purchased. I did not sign the easement. I had no idea, really what they had purchased, but I assumed it was the big, deep slough on the north end of the property. However, they were claiming easement on everything. So I thought, well, that's funny. I asked them to send me a map, and they did. They sent me a map that I know came from NRCS, and it had a whole bunch of circles on it, including what would amount to trees, rock piles, and other things. So, in discussion with other legislators, we decided the only way that we were going to be able to bring this to a head on behalf of all private property owners in North Dakota was to litigate and enforce delineation. So we put forward a bill that asks the Attorney General to do just that. During the hearing in the House, many of these fine people were here, and I want to congratulate everybody that came to speak today. And I want to thank them for their participation in the hearing that we had in 2013. Story after story, the same type of enforcement, the same type of response from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, was presented to the committee. We asked questions, we got answers, and all with a U.S. Fish and Wildlife employee sitting there. Finally, after everybody presented their evidence, it was his turn. And legislators had questions for him. During the questioning, and I don't remember if it was myself or Representative Brandenburg or maybe it was Chairman Johnson who asked the question about specific delineation. And his response just struck me. In fact, it did more than that. It irritated me because his response was something to the effect of, read the fine print. We have easement over the whole tract of property. Now, that might not be his exact words. I'll tell you, we can get his exact words if we want to go back to the library and get the record. That irritated me a bit, and I used that irritation in a floor speech that I gave in passage of the bill. Now, against the wishes of our state attorney general, we passed that bill in the House. Now, when it got to the Senate, it changed. It changed into the law that we have today, which essentially says that any easement 50 years or older must be renegotiated, and if it is not, if you cannot come to a negotiated deal, it's null and void. Now, that law took effect in, I believe, August 1st of 2017. That is the state law that is now in effect. Was it July 1st? So, what are we as legislators, what's our next move? I'm excited to hear about the language that you've had put in an appropriations bill. I don't know what it exactly speaks to. If it mirrors it, that would be fantastic. But I fully suspect that future legislatures will set aside money and do what the very law says that it's going to do. And we will fight the federal government on this. This is federal overreach. I think you can see why North Dakota supports our current president the way they do, because he said he's going to help us with these kind of things. The reasons why we put in the legislation and what the legislation does.
Thank you, Craig. So, just to, yeah. What the language I was able to put in is considered report language. It's in an appropriations bill, which is appropriations, is new policy and appropriations, but it's also a good vehicle because appropriations bills always come to the floor, unlike in North Dakota. A lot of amendments come to the floor, hundreds of them, in fact, several hundred. And so we were able to get a reference to the contentiousness between the landowners and the Fish and Wildlife Service, raising the Congress is concerned about that contentious relationship, that we acknowledge the law that you passed, and that the thing basically instructs the Fish and Wildlife Service to do as much as they can to work within the North Dakota state law. Now, all of that said, there is this obvious conflict of federal law trumping state law. But it's a start. And to your point of litigating, since you brought it up, it's an issue I've jotted down. And I hate the notion of litigation. But you know what's gotten us to this point in a lot of these kinds of issues over the last several years, especially the most recent 8, is that the extremists on the left sue their extremists in the White House in an extremist left-wing judge's courtroom, and then they, instead of having a hearing, they go into his chambers and cut a deal, and the taxpayers pay everybody's legal fees, and pretty soon every critter that walks, flies, or swims is an endangered species, and they have more rights than you have.
Yes.
This is a very fundamental problem. Today, to your point, there's a different White House, which is partly why we're here today, because there's a different Interior Secretary, and they're appointing different people at the helm. But the bureaucracy often waits out the politics. That's why there's urgency to this issue. So keep it up. I hate to advocate litigation, you guys. But one of the problems you have, as I stated earlier with Fish and Wildlife and this easement issue, is there isn't an administrative law process. You have no appeal except to go back to the same guy with the gun and the attitude. And so we've got to fix, and I think, frankly, if there's one thing I think I could get done, then we'll try hard to do legislatively, and that is to provide an appeal process, so that even somebody from San Francisco should understand that a person ought to have the right to appeal a decision by a law enforcement officer. So we've got some work to do, but thanks, Craig.
Well, thank you, and Congressman, I think all the legislators here would agree that litigation is the last resort. But we have to look at the economics of how not only affects each private property owner, but it's affecting revenues for the state of North Dakota in a very large way. And, we are assigned as elected to protect North Dakota revenues.
Well, and the Johansson case has demonstrated that there is a problem and that it can be won. The problem is having the resources to take these things on is very difficult to do without the aggregated generosity of the taxpayer. And we've done it before. Waters of the U.S. was largely an issue that you as legislators funded in a courtroom in Fargo. That's why we're having to turn back the waters of the United States. So there's, I encourage you to do what you can, realizing that you have limitations as well in the budget, right? Wendy, come on up. Mike Brandenburg. Mike's got both legislative and personal stories to tell.
Thank you, Congressman Kramer, and Matt and Maureen, I want to thank you too for being here. Just you being here is showing that you are concerned and want to figure out what's going on. Because what's going on right now is not right. And I know the people that are working at my local area, Mick Erickson and Dave Azure, you may know them, are good people, and they know that what they're working with here is what got left behind by people who didn't do it right. Okay, with that, I just want to start out, give you a compliment, because I get done, I'm probably not going to get carried away as Chad, but I'm pretty passionate about this too. But he can't help it, he's got Terry. You understand, he's Terry is dad. This all kind of started out for me back when I was probably in, I don't know, 28, 27, 28, and I come from a farm in Lemoore County in the Nora Township, and that's what I've handed out to you there. Anyway, my dad and my grandfather and Emil is the one who signed this easement, and I farm with 3 of my sons. I have 3 brothers involved in the farm, and I have a couple of nephews involved with the farm. And my dad is still alive, and we call him General. And so, if you know what I'm like, you'll understand what this conversation was like. Anyway, one day, fishing, we were out there cleaning out. You can look at the maps and you'll see, and I believe it was probably my grandfather, probably in 86, 87, somewhere in that area. We went out and we were cleaning out some ditches. And all of a sudden, there's 2 guys showed up. One guy with a gun, and then one guy with papers. And they said we had violated the easement of this wetland. So my grandpa and my dad and myself, we went out there in the land and we laid the papers on the hood of the pickup. The guy with the gun stood behind us, with his hand on the gun. And we went over this paper, looking at the easement. The easement's in front of you. And my grandpa said, no, that's not true. That's not what it said. I wrote all the ditches in. He said, all we're dealing with here is the wetlands. And there's about 30 acres of wetlands. And out of 640 acres. And you can see this was sold for 640 acres, the whole section. And there was about 30 acres of wetlands. And that's what my grandpa said was 30 acres. Nowhere in there will you find 30 acres. But it is about 30 acres. I went over to talk with Dave and Mick, and I think I got it pinned down. I think it's 32 acres off the top of my head. So, but my grandpa kept referring to it as about 30 acres. So anyway, and if you look at the map, see, this here was on the August 2nd of 1967. And so we ran them up. Basically, you could say we ran them up. Well, it wasn't more than, I don't know, a few days later, here comes the guy again with papers, but he'd come with 3 guys with guns. And this got confrontational. This lasted for 3 hours. And we went back and forth, and what I remember, and I've been in court, I'm 60 years old, going to be 61, so I've had some legal activities in my life. And one thing I know about dealing with legal activities is that they're always going to ask your name. Emil Brandenburg, is that your signature? Did you sign that? Is that your name? Yes, it is. I signed it, but that's not what that man told me. That man told me it's only going to be the easement on the wetlands, and the wetlands is the only thing that's going to be involved here. And my grandpa believed in, in the wetlands. He's going to get some money for that. Nowhere and ever was the discussion about encompassing the whole 640 acres. And I look at what my grandpa looked at, and if you go to the first whereas on the first page, go to the long legal paper where it says the first whereas, and it says right there, it authorizes the Secretary of Interior to acquire small wetland or pothole areas suitable for use as waterfall production area. That's what it says. And right below it in the next whereas, it says, the lands described below include small wetlands or pothole areas for waterfall production areas. Nowhere in this does it say it's the whole 640 acres. Then you can refer back to I'll refer to the next page that was signed August 4th of 67, and it talks about the easements of the railroad property in there. There's not one area drawn out. The only thing that's drawn out there is there's a ditch in there, and actually my grandpa had the Landowner drain in the 60s because there was a program, so grandpa thought, the land's all drained. I think, what the world, well, I'm gonna get $640 for 30-some acres that I'm never gonna farm. That was his exact comments. But the only thing he didn't do was that, and he never thought they were that important, but the finger ditches, you know, the main ditch he wrote in, but the finger ditches he did not. That's where the fight started with these guys. And if you refer to the next map, which was done in November, December of 2001, it's got all the potholes drawn in. They're not there in 67. They are in 2001. If you look at the FSA map in 79, there's no blue dots. So, okay, I made my point with that. Anyway, going back to the conversation that we had for 3 hours. My dad talked. I added a little bit, but I was mostly watching. My grandpa went back and forth with this guy. He was going to run this guy down that signed him the easement, and he was dead. And he was down in Denver, but he wasn't alive anymore, so they couldn't even find him. But he got my grandpa. And so after about 3 hours of discussing this and going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and then finally, we realized, we're not getting anywhere. They got the easement. We ended up plugging the ditches. We did that. But the only time in my life I ever seen my grandpa cry was when those 4 guys drove away. And I never forgot it. My grandpa was a proud man. And this is a situation that not only happened to my grandpa, it happened to Dennis's dad, it happened to probably 90%, 100% of the people in this room. Where these easements were taken, it's 50 years old too. So that law that we got in the books in North Dakota that us legislators work on this last session as well as these farmers, and we do have a litigation fund, and we put that together for Waters of the USA, and there's $1 million camped in the Ag Department right now for something like this. So I can guarantee you that we're not done. So what I'm asking you folks, it's time. And I had this conversation with Mick Erickson and Dave Azure too. It's not your fault. You weren't there. I wasn't there. It was done by people from the past. But in this world today, litigation is everywhere. There's a point where things that were done wrong need to be done right. And so, okay, I acknowledge that on this 640 acres, there's 30 or 32 acres of wetlands that my grandpa signed up. I acknowledge that. But I don't acknowledge that when we have wet years. I had 150 acres on this land that I could not farm because we can't clean out these finger ditches. It did not get seeded. So it wasn't that 30 that I'm arguing. I'm arguing the 150 I can't farm. So it's time. It's time. And hey, we are in the world of lawsuits. We got to learn from the people who what they did, the environmentalists have come after us, and they started the lawsuits, and we laughed at them. When I got in the legislature 20 years ago, I thought, these guys are nuts. But they were smarter than us because they got ahead of us. I go back to the hippie days. Some of them grew up and became lawyers, and the dumb ones tied themselves to the towers out there, whatever. That's what's happened. They became legislators. They became congressional people. They became people like us. And so today, we have a litigation fund. We have the law in the books. But the real answer to this is, why can't we work this out? Why can't we use common sense to say that, yep, make something work? Because when we go to court, I don't know what's going to happen. Probably I'll spend much money, but that's where it's probably going to go. That's probably where it's at. And I guess I said what I had to say. I hope I made sense. I hope I didn't offend you, because I wanted to, I've been to a number of meetings where you go up there and everybody hollers and makes everybody mad to go home and say, well, I'm glad I can get out of here, we don't want to do nothing. I really think, though, we're at the point with this administration and the situation that we have in the state of North Dakota. We got the law in the books. I mean, this is 50 years old on September 15th. Actually signed on the 2nd, but it wasn't signed in Washington, but part of the carried on 15th September. It's there. It's a landmark case. Here we go. And how we were treated that day, with the 3 guys with guns, 1 guy with papers, I'll never forget. Because, and when my grandpa, I just, anyway, you got it. You got it. All right.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, thanks. Okay, thank you very much. So, I'm going to do something I promised myself I wasn't going to do, but we're not going to leave this wide open. It's not going to be open-ended. But we will not go past 11:30 because I have another thing I've got to do, and then I've got to go to, I've got to go to Fargo. So, see, here's what I want to do at this point. First of all, is there anything so far that you guys have heard that you haven't responded to that you want to respond? No. Okay. Okay. So, I want to open it up a little bit now for people who we didn't have on our list. Greg, did you want to say something, Representative Westland?
Not really.
Representative Damschen?
It's just would be the same thing.
The same, I have a feeling we're going to allow the same thing. I'm going to, Terry, get up, and then Levi, okay? All right, Gordon. Terry, Levi, Gordon, keep helping me remember.
Thank you, Congressman Kramer and Marie and Matt. When my boys came home to farm, we bought a farm out of Hertzfield, and had easements on it. Okay. So they were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. We want to set up a meeting, so we called and set up a meeting. Well, by the time we got done with the meeting, they were threatening to come in and take us to court because we were ditching out a wetland. We weren't ditching it. It was Mother Nature. There was so much water, and what I was trying to get him to do at the time is let's put a limit on this. It's going to be 4 feet deep. Because to my understanding, they don't want sloughs full of cattails. That's not the best habitat. So it's like, okay, let's put a pipe in, let's cap this thing at 4 feet, we'll respect it, we'll stay out of it, we'll treat it right. And then let's tile some of the land in between these things so that we can get our productivity levels back up. And it was just ridiculous. Like you said, 3 guys with guns, and by the time we got done, and we're trying to offer solutions, because a lot of the wetlands that we have through all these years of rain have naturally eroded the outlets. Yeah. But my next fear is they're going to come in and say we did it with equipment. You know, so that's the way it goes. You know, they're right and we're wrong. And you talked about, we had to sell 60 acres of land to the state because of mitigation on the federal highway. I mean, if you would dig into the cost of what it cost the state of North Dakota, because not unlike the guy who told the story, the slough got bigger. Now we build the road bigger, and there's no credit, and they're supposed to, you know, I think it's costing the state of North Dakota somewhere around $50,000 an acre to mitigate. It's taking roads out of our hands that shouldn't be, because we have U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they got to abide by FEMA, you know, and everything's out of whack.
Yeah. Well said there. In fact, I think it goes back to a couple of things that it does. One is, with regard to this administration, we should look maybe into this a little more. But the president did sign, you sparked this memory for me, he did sign a recent executive order relating to infrastructure, where he's trying to streamline the certification and permitting process, because there are so multiple agencies. It's beyond reason, to say the least. One of the things he's been trying to do is harmonize a lot of agencies and the duplication of their work, because a lot of it, frankly, is just designed for chaos. So there's that, we'll look into that and see if there's not, what's coming along those lines, because the country can't afford to build infrastructure. Secondly, you sparked something else, getting back to the litigation idea. Again, I leave this to the legislators, you know your budget. But one of the frustrations I've had as a private property rights conservative in North Dakota over the last couple of decades at least is we're so darn nice that we sort of let the federal government tell us what our laws are. Do you know what I mean? I mean, we claim that the Missouri River is ours, but we let the Corps of Engineers invite us to their hearings. Did you know what I'm saying? And so I applaud you guys that are going to go a little bit further and test this idea of federalism. Test what the founding fathers had in mind when they said, no, the water belongs to the state, not to the federal government. It's not their jurisdiction, it's yours. Navigable means you put a barge on it, not, that it might come down your drain spout of your barn. But we just, as stoic Norwegians and Germans and nice Midwesterners, we've just sort of let the federal government creep into our world. And I applaud you state legislators that are willing to say, no, you know what? This rectangle in the middle of the North American continent, that's my jurisdiction. And so I'm glad you let me go to Washington and represent you, but I also applaud you for standing up. And I think it's important to have leadership all the way through the governor that willing to push that envelope a little bit. Because as far as I'm concerned, the sheriff has the jurisdiction in the county.
But anyway, Star Ryan's map, and that's the deal we fight.
Thanks, Terry.
Because everything's so off balance. Thank you.
Levi Otis. And Levi, a proud alum of Devils Lake High School, and we do have some students here today, and we're really glad you're here, and we hope you're not getting bored. This is better than civics class, I guarantee you. And welcome to all of you.
Morning, Congressman Kramer, Marine, thank you for the time. Obviously, judging by the room, I think, if we held it at the Memorial Building, you would see 4 times as many people here. A lot of points were hit today, and I'm glad it's on video, and I think a lot of good people are going to be able to siphon through some of the talking points. I believe after talking to all these folks and my grandfather and these guys' grandparents, what was done in the mid-1900s about, the 1940s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s was predatory. It was predatory by our federal government to come in and say, times are tough, I want that wetland. And, Grandpa Joe says, well, I ain't never gonna farm that, it's been wet my whole life, right? And you've heard the story, so I'm not gonna be redundant on that. I'm gonna give you an experience that I had last year, a year and a half ago. We had a customer, we're in the land improvement business, i.e. tiling, and he called us and said, I've got some tile that was put in 1983. And I said, really? It's in 1983. Most people don't know tile. I think tile came to North Dakota in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I said, let's take a look. So we went out, and he had bought this property in the mid-90s. And he had us go in and replace this clay tile that was put in the 80s, which also is interesting because our company started putting plastic tile in southern Minnesota in 1970. So this is about 15 years later, it's clay tile, we go in and fix it. Not kidding you, the next day, I get a call from the landowner, Levi, there's people with guns on my farm. I'm like, uh-oh, what's going on? I said, you have U.S. Fish and Wildlife easements. He said, no, across the quarter line there's easements. And so he called, he's worked up, they showed up with guns, and then they want to talk to me. So we go out, and I don't know if you folks are aware, but there is a building that U.S. Fish and Wildlife has in the middle of nowhere, North Dakota, that looks like the most beautiful cabin you've ever seen. I bet you this thing's like $3-4 million. And so we show up, and I think there was 5 officers there with weapons, and flak jackets. I mean, the Secret Service, we had the opportunity to see the president a couple weeks ago. The Secret Service aren't as intimidating as this meeting was. And we walk in, and they have all these maps, and they tell the kid, I shouldn't call him a kid, but I think he was younger than me. He says, we sent you a letter in 1993 about the easements. And I kind of looked at him, I said, what do you mean we sent you a letter? You're younger than me, I was in 3rd grade in 1993, so what are you talking about? So I guess the point is, you know, I got to know law enforcement pretty well growing up here in Devils Lake. Sheriff Nelson. But if the chief, who was a highway patrolman at the time, wrote me a ticket for speeding, and I wanted to argue with him, and he said I was doing 40 and a 30, and I said I was doing 34 and a 30, I don't go to him and argue my speeding ticket. That is not the appeals process. I go to the court, and I talk to the judge, and I say, well, Judge, Joe did get me doing 34, but he didn't get me doing 40, all right? So maybe my ticket got dropped down. So to your credit, Congressman, I think the appeals process, there needs to be something developed. I think we have to recognize that it was predatory back in the day. We also have to recognize that our grandparents signed some of these, but if we're not going to work together, then we litigate. And I truly believe the way our forefathers set up this country, we will win in the end.
Gordon, did I? Yep.
Public speaking is not my bag, but I just wrote a couple of notes here that as the meeting went on.
Get real close to that microphone so we can.
Some of them will be probably a little repetitions. But one of the things, I was at a meeting in Jamestown a few years back, and I mentioned about the identifying the wetlands. And the statement the Fish and Wildlife people made at that meeting was to take control to the top of the hill and things like that. Period. Another statement, and I might mention about the guns. I had 6 Fish and Wildlife people out in the middle of the field with me, and we were talking about water management, and I was trying to get the water off the highway, which I paid for. The water was running on my land, and I went through this process of health and safety, economic impact. And the person from Fish and Wildlife looked at me, the big guy, and said, we have no interest in your health, your safety, or the economic impact it's having on you and the community. Pretty nice statement, huh? Another time, at the, you know, all the little guys, especially guys who fish like Mike McEnroe was out to the farm, and I said, Mike, as long as you hear let's identify these wetlands. I had stakes and I had the rubber boots, and it was red. Mac looked at me, and he said, I'm not going to do this. I have no interest in identifying these wetlands. And I said, Max, how can you expect me to go by anything you say? No interest. I've done land appraisals for quite a few years, worked with FHA also. And my normal was if there was an easement on the property, depending on the valuation, usually run from about $100 to $500 an acre that I knocked off. Oh, there was the other one that just mentioned too, about rocks. Well, that was a dandy. Our friend the farm's land called me one day and he said, I've got 2 Fish and Wildlife people. And you have to realize this guy is about that big and his wife is the same. And these 2 big guys with guns come in his house, scared the liver out of him. And when he said, they said we put rocks in this hole. I said, well, did you? Oh, no. Okay. And about 5 minutes later, they called me and said, you got to get those rocks out of there. I said, well, the guy that farms the land said he didn't put it in. I said, he's the most honest guy and honorable guy I know. We didn't put it in for didn't know. And they hassled me for 3 years on that. Finally, one day, they said they're gonna have me in court in Washington. I said, that's fine, because any damn fool knows that I went out there and checked the rocks, and there weren't any new rocks on the rock pile. And I said, any damn fool knows that those are all rocks. Well, 3 months later, I got a letter from them. They weren't going to bring charges against me because just that was great. Look, I was not to put any more rocks in the slough. The economics, I kind of figured this out one time, and the health safety thing is a big thing. I got a picture of the road that we were trying to protect. There were 6 guys from Fish and Wildlife all in the field, and they all had guns. I was out there with myself. That's scary. But anyway, I estimated that we lost somewhere around $1 million in lost income because of the easements and the swamp buster farm program. I could go on here for another hour, but I think you get the general idea. Most experiences these guys have talked about, I've been through them all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we have another person right here, and then Cale, if you don't mind, before we do have an attorney, and he raised this issue, it might be a good time to get just some perspective on some of what's been said. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I am from Bottineau County. I'm with the Bottineau County Water Resource Board. I have been the chairman of the North Dakota Water Resource Districts for many years during Swamp Busters, so I understand what baptism under fire is. I want to relate to you something that you are trying to put together. I invited the manager of the J. Clark Salyer Refuge and his wetland specialist, Frank Durbin and John Takala, to a meeting that I put together with landowners in Newburgh, North Dakota. We had about 12 landowners there, none of them armed. Frank and John walked in, armed to the teeth. I saw them come in, and I stopped them at the door. I said, Frank and John, we're not armed, you don't need to be armed. They went through the whole ritual about how we're regularly supposed to wear this. I said, take it outside, put it in your pickup, lock it up, come back in. They did that, and I thanked them. We had a very productive meeting. As a result of that productive meeting, we had another meeting out on the landscape where we had perpetual easements on this land, and that chart right there says a lot. The easements were 2 acres, but the alkali had grown out of their 2-acre easements and spread farther upland, downland, sideways, until there wasn't anything productive between the wetlands. So here comes a duck, boom, right in the center of this wetland. Frank is elated. This is what we're all about. Wow, Frank, that's really good. Can I ask you a question, Frank? Yeah, go ahead. How come I can see the duck a quarter of a mile away? Well, that's a good question. How come there's no cattails, no brome grass around that wetland? I shouldn't be able to see the duck. Yeah, you're right. I said, I think I'm going to hold you personally responsible and liable for killing the land outside of your 2-acre easement. You are killing land that you don't even have an easement on. Needless to say, this discussion ended pretty quick. But 2 weeks later, I got a call from Frank. He said, Cliff, you know, you might have something here. So if you take this short presentation about you didn't need the armament to get the meeting, and we had a productive meeting out on the landscape, I think there's a possibility that they can acknowledge that they are not good soil caretakers of the land. North Dakota farmers are, and they want to preserve it, and they want to grow crops. We do not need alkali coming out of our wetlands. So when you put it all together, when we look at what the Fish and Wildlife has and what they think they've got, it's two different things. North Dakota farmers can grow good crops, but we can't grow it in dead soil. They need to acknowledge the fact they need to have soil health responsibility. North Dakota farmers have that. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, I'm sorry, you need to learn it. And by the way, I'm from Kramer, North Dakota.
Yeah. Very well said. And it does get to an important point, I think, that we oftentimes in these discussions, debates, when they become contentious for whatever reason, tend to go to our corners, right, and dig in. When the reality is, one of the things, by the way, the Kramer Amendment, the nuisance wetland amendment in the Farm Bill, passed unanimously. And the way it passed unanimously was by getting conservationists and landowners together and explaining how this can be good for everybody. But we oftentimes don't talk about what can be good for everybody. I think to your point about soil health and you know, cross-pollination, if you will, of missions, we can find that there's a lot more in common than that. I've asked Cale to share a little bit as we wrap up here from the legal perspective, because he's provided some information to me and been helpful. And if you could just provide a little clarity from the legal perspective, because at the end of the day, there are a lot of people who want to do the right thing, but whose hands are tied by various statutes, rules, regulations, laws. And so, Cale, if you could just enlighten us a little bit.
Well, Congressman, some of the state legislators in the room can tell you that if you invite me up at the end to wrap up and be brief, sometimes that's a little bit of a challenge. So I will try to keep it to the highlights. My name is Cale Van Bruggen. I'm an attorney, and 100% of my practice is representing farmers, agriculture interests, some local governments, water boards in North Dakota on issues related to water management. Work in North Dakota, Minnesota, and Northern Iowa. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service easement land representing farmers trying to navigate the cases that interpret the language of those easements is one of the things that I do. A lot of the other work I do with NRCS, we're interpreting regulations. With the Army Corps and the EPA under the Clean Water Act, we're interpreting regulations. With Fish and Wildlife Service, there are no regulations. There's no administrative process to interpret. It's a very vague easement document that meant one thing very clearly to the service if you read the case law when it was negotiated. And today, through how the service handled their arguments in those cases, one before the Supreme Court and one before the 8th Circuit, now means something completely different. So we're always going to have that conflict between what says in the document is certainly not the intent, but the way the agency argued those cases, now we're arguing about it means something different than what it says. So that's a challenge. One of the things I've never understood about conservation officers and bringing guns, I remember the very first case I had as an attorney on a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service dispute, and showing up and dealing with a law enforcement officer rather than a scientist who works for the agency was a surprise to me.
Because wetlands are very interesting resources. One of the things that we do in Minnesota very often where wetland mitigation is a common practice, they have a good banking program that happens very quickly and very efficiently, is helping landowners prepare the documents to record to create wetland banks. And I've worked on banks that are anywhere from 10 acres to 300 acres to 10,000 acres up in northern Minnesota that were drained for over 100 years. And when the Army Corps and the EPA and the state agencies in Minnesota certify those banks, they release the wetland credits based on the schedule of when does that return to a wetland. This has been drained for 100 years. The longest schedule I've seen is 5 years. So why we need to bring a gun to intimidate someone who's concerned about an impact to a wetland? If an impact happens, it can be resolved and it can be fixed. And you guys know as Fish and Wildlife Service better than anybody, wetlands can be easily restored. This isn't a resource we will lose forever if the dispute is not intimidated and stopped right at the front end. But then it became clear to me, because as I started to research these easements and what's the process, I just want to walk through, for the room, what I walk through clients through when they call and say, I have property, it has issues, and I know I can't drain the wetlands that are protected, but I want to manage the rest of the property. What do I do? Well, you go to the county recorder first. Is there a map recorded? If there is, now you know where the wetlands are that are protected, because the courts have clearly said you look at what's recorded first. Most easements don't have that. So then what do? You asked the Fish and Wildlife Service for their map. It wasn't recorded, so that is just the agency's interpretation based on the evidence and work that they've done of where the wetlands are that are protected. If you ask them, well, I have this evidence and I don't agree with that, the answer you get is, well, that's our process. So if you don't agree with it, there's nothing that we can do about that can be done with that. So then I tell them, well, I will never as an attorney be able to get you to a point of regulatory certainty like I can with the NRCS and say that now your tile plan has been approved, and if you spend the thousands of dollars on that tile system and put that plow on the ground, I can guarantee you that no matter the consequence of your action, it's been signed off on and you won't have to go tear that back up. We don't have that right now with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's something I think legislatively that can be worked on. So what do? They hire a technical consultant. They put together maps. They try to put together the best evidence they can as to where were the wetlands on the date the easement was granted, because that's the standard that the courts have very clearly stated. But at the end of the day, when it's done, I say you have one map from the agency, and you have your map that you believe in from your technical consultant, and what's going to matter is which one that federal judge thinks is the better evidence. Why can't we have a process where you can have some more regulatory certainty before you make that kind of investment, where a third party who's not a law enforcement officer and someone who's trained to listen to evidence and scientific evidence and technical evidence can make a decision? And I would say, I think one of the things, a 5,000-foot setback to someone who's listening to technical evidence. It's nice for the agency. I get, I think, why from an agency resource perspective that you want to stop these things on the front end, because you know that you also have to use the court system to resolve your differences if you believe that your evidence is correct. But if you also had an administrative process available to you, then at least you could have a weighing of the evidence and you could use something that's a lot cheaper agency resource than having to also litigate and then have this really difficult PR problem where, to avoid litigation, you're using intimidation in order to prevent it getting to that point. Congressman, I really appreciate this. Thank you.
What's your sense of how much discretion there may be that doesn't get used the way you and I might think it should be used with the service? You know what I'm saying? In other words, why is the default always to be against the landowner instead of for the landowner?
I don't understand what the internal trainings are of the agency, and I'll never have access to that. But I know, and this happens in any agency, that depending on which conservation area I'm in or I'm representing a client, I'm getting a very different story on the ground. I have worked often with David Azure, his name was brought up before. He's read the cases, he understands the rules. I enjoy when he's on the other side of the table. Because I know now that I know the rules and he does, and we can get to what is the law rather than dispute over things that aren't true. Just one more quick point. Wetland mitigation, from a conservation and environmental standpoint, all of the laws that deal with wetlands, that protect wetlands, say you protect the wetlands as they exist today. They don't impose requirements that you enhance those wetlands. So if you aren't supporting wetland mitigation, you're not supporting a conservation type effort. When you mitigate a wetland, if you have a seasonally ponded wetland that only holds water for maybe the bare minimum of 14 days, and then it dries up, it gets planted, it gets hit with inputs on farming, it's not a very high quality wetland to the environment or to the watershed. When you mitigate that wetland, you don't create the same 14-day ponding, then later farmed wetland. You create a high value, function and value wetland, an acre over here, an improvement on the wetland acres than the one that you are now draining and managing for water. So I would think that if you're conservation focused and that's your goal, is to improve conservation, you'd be doing anything you could to support wetland mitigation.
Well said. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Maureen. Did you guys want to say anything wrapping up? I mean, you've done the best thing you can do, and that's listen, really. So we appreciate it. But would you like to wrap up with anything?
So I just want to thank you all for coming, and it was very helpful to me to hear everything that you guys had to say. The one, couple of points that I wanted to make with respect to progress that we're making, and Matt and Dave Asher, as we heard about, and also Frank Derbian as well, have been really instrumental in working through some of these things and we're trying to figure out with our personnel, how do we do better? How do we move on from the way we have interacted with folks in the past? A couple of things that we're working on actually is sort of changing the position descriptions of the folks who are involved in managing easements, looking at how we can get biologists and managers out working with you all more often than law enforcement officers. But then also, we've developed an easement training program in the Fish and Wildlife Service that should debut here in a few weeks. And we haven't had that in the past. We haven't had opportunities for our employees to really understand what easements are, how they're managed, how you interact with landowners, those sorts of things. So that's something that we are building and trying to move forward on. And one of the big takeaways that I'm having personally from this is how do we incorporate interactions with landowners in that training, in a training module, so that they can get some real world experience before they're going out and having an interaction with you all. So I really do appreciate the invitation. It's been very enlightening. Thank you.
I'll echo Maureen's response. Just thank you all for coming, and I don't want to shy away from this. I try to make myself available, whether it's at the Devil's Lake Joint Water Board. I'm religiously at those meetings, and I have business cards here, and if there are questions, concerns, get a hold of us. I mean, opening up communication, facilitating communication is, I think, the most important thing we can do.
Well done. Thank you all for being here.